Considering how late I'm posting this video, you probably have a ton of characters on your account. But do you know how to use them together? If you've just started the game recently, or you haven't given it much thought, team building can be a little daunting. In this video, we'll be going over everything relevant to team building, some general team archetypes, and tips to improve your gameplay. We won't be going super in-depth, but just enough to give you a good understanding of what makes a good functional team. Before we get into team building, we have to quickly talk about the combat system. At this point in the game, you probably already know most of this, but we're going to quickly review it here anyways. Honkai Star Rail's combat system is a turn-based game is mostly based around skill point management and elemental typing. Every enemy will have some weaknesses. You learned this in the tutorial that you should use a character with the corresponding element to take advantage of that weakness. But do you actually know why that is? If you don't, enemies naturally resist 20% of damage to enemies that they are not weak to, and furthermore resist 10% of all damage if they have their toughness bar up. Some enemies like Japard naturally resist certain elements even more, with him specifically having high ice resistance. And if you're not good at math, I'll spell it out for you. All of this damage resistance adds up and will block a large portion of your damage if you don't use the right elements. And this is the main reason why it's recommended that you use characters with the right elements, and why it's important for you to have enough characters on your account to cover every elemental weakness. Generally, for tougher content, you'll want at least 2 units that can break the toughness of the boss, otherwise you're going to be there for a very long time. Skill points. Moving on to skill point management. Skill points are the main resource that your team uses and is a huge factor in whether or not your team can function optimally. In its simplest form, you can classify characters between 2 categories, maybe 3 if you're feeling a little spicy. Skill point positive, skill point negative, and something along the lines of skill point neutral. A lot of your characters will vary between how many skill points they use, depending on how much energy recharge you have, your team composition, and how you like to use the character personally. Skill point negative characters tend to be your main DPS characters. This will usually be your hunt and erudition characters like Jingjuan or Sile. As their name suggests, skill point negative characters will use skill points very often. Skill point positive characters are the opposite. You don't have to use their skills that often, or you can afford skipping out on using their skill, and therefore you'll be basic attacking and gaining skill points. These characters will typically consist of your survivability units and your support units, like Tingyun and Natasha. However, like most things, there are exceptions. You might have noticed that some characters, like Bronya or Asta, despite being support units, end up using a lot of skill points. And it's for this reason that we can't just classify every character based off of their class, and you actually have to look at them as individual characters. And similarly, there are some characters that will use a lot of skill points depending on the team comp and depending on the playstyle, but in other playstyles or other team comps, you won't be using that many. The best way to know is to just try them out and get a feel for them and how they work in your specific team. However, I did make a little table here to sort of classify the characters depending on their skill point usage. Obviously, I haven't used every single character in the game, there's simply not enough resources to go around to do that, but I have tried my best to make this table as unbiased and as truthful as possible, but at the end of the day, it is just my opinion, so please take it with a grain of salt. Take a moment to pause the video and quickly look if you need to. I did mark a couple of characters with stars for ones that are pretty situational. This table was made with E0 characters in mind, but as constellations go up and depending on your team, these can vary quite a bit. When looking at all of the preservation units, maybe with the exception of Japard, there is kind of a need to use a lot of skill points if you're using them as your sole survivability unit. If you've ever used March as your only survivability unit on a team, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. You have to spam your shield very often to ensure that your teammates don't get slammed. Looking at you, Tingyun. But if you were to pair your preservation units with a healer, for example, you'll basically rarely have to use your skill. The only one on this list that I'm not very comfortable commenting on is Herta and Yukong, because I haven't had much time to test them out. In any case, this table is subject to change, and if you disagree with this table, please let me know your thoughts in the comments and how you would change it personally. Moving on to general team building guidelines now. The fundamental tip for team building is to balance your skill point usage. You probably want to aim for around 2 skill point positive characters and 2 skill point negative characters. And obviously, you can mix and match depending on the character. For example, let's take this current team composition. Yanqing, Welt, Tingyun, and Natasha. Yanqing and Welt will be your skill point negative characters, and Tingyun and Natasha will be your skill point positive. On your first turn, you're going to be using skill points on Yanqing, Welt, and Tingyun. Natasha likely won't need to heal since you just started the fight. From there, you can simply skill with Yanqing and Welt whenever you can. Eventually, when you need to skill with Tingyun, you can just auto tackle with Welt for that one turn. Rule number 2. Balance roles within the team. These are pretty obvious. There's a couple of roles that you always want to fill to create an effective team. Obviously, you'll want at least one survivability unit for most content in the game, and these will be your preservation and your abundance characters. Abundance is mostly catered to healing your characters, while preservation is based around having shields and other utilities. Depending on the level of investment, one preservation unit may or may not be enough to keep you alive long enough to finish the content before your team dies. If you do choose to use one preservation unit, keep in mind that you'll be using a lot more skill points than if you were using 2. And if one preservation unit isn't enough, you'll probably want to use 2. For more difficult content like Memory of Chaos or maybe the weekly bosses, you'll want to use both a preservation and an abundance unit. Besides survivability, you'll want at least one dedicated DPS. Without a DPS, you'll take way longer to clear the content in the game, and you won't have a reliable way to break toughness. Your DPS classes will be the Erudition, Hunt, and Destruction classes. Honestly, there isn't a huge difference between the classes. I found that personally you can get by in most situations using Erudition and Destruction and not having to worry about that lack of single target DPS, but personally have noticed that if you use Hunt characters that aren't Seele, you'll definitely want to supplement them with some form of AoE damage to help clear out smaller enemies. At the end of the day, damage is damage, and you can experiment to find out what you prefer the most. Throughout this video, you might have noticed that I've mentioned the concept of a sub-DPS. Maybe you're wondering what's the difference between a DPS and a sub-DPS. Honestly, to answer that, it's a pretty loose definition, and I think it mostly depends on how you use them in the team. Obviously, as DPS characters, they're both skill point negative, and in that regard, they're very similar. I consider DPS characters to be the damage character that you are very heavily invested into, and always use skill points on them. Sub-DPS characters are ones that will use skill points if you can, but also you'll probably want to use them for other purposes, such as debuffing or breaking shields. Let's take Serval as an example. Depending on how you use her or build her, you can be both a DPS and a sub-DPS. As a DPS, you'll obviously want to build her with lots of crit and spam skill points very often so that you can use your ult, therefore just pump out a ton of damage that way. As a sub-DPS, she won't be having the spotlight, and you'd probably build her around her shock damage, which means attack and break effect, and mostly using your skill to reapply shock. And this way, she does end up doing a lot of damage, but doesn't use nearly as much skill points and doesn't require nearly as much investment. And by this definition, you can classify most characters as sub-DPSs. A lot of AoE characters you can play as a sub-DPS. A lot of destruction characters I feel like you can play as a sub-DPS. And typically, since they don't have enough damage compared to some of the Erudition characters and Hunt characters, it's harder to play them as a full-on DPS. Nihility characters are actually very often capable of putting out a lot of damage, especially with the release of Kafka. I think that most people will soon to realize that Nihility actually is basically another damage class, but with the added benefit of adding debuffs that can increase your whole team's damage. Another consideration is using buffers and debuffers, or as I like to call them, utility characters. These two types of characters are typically easier to build or don't require a large initial investment to use them properly, and can provide a lot of benefit without needing the same amount of investment as you would with an Erudition or Hunt character. These are mostly your Harmony and Nihility characters, and will usually greatly increase your team's damage output, and are amazing units to just fill your team with no matter the content. For some people, it might be a little confusing to know whether or not you should level up or use a sub-DPS or maybe a utility character, and to that I would say it mostly depends on the content that you're doing or your account personally. If you have a super invested character like Jin Yuan with his light cone, you probably don't need a sub-DPS since he does so much damage already. On the other hand, if your DPS doesn't match the specific enemy's weakness, you'll probably want to bring a sub-DPS to help break their toughness. Similarly, in scenarios where there is a large quantity of small enemies and your main DPS is Hunt, you'll probably want a sub-DPS of some sort to help deal with those smaller enemies. On the other hand, Utility characters are ones that work basically universally and will always increase your damage. Typically, they do use less skill points than a sub-DPS at the cost of less individual damage. And I'd say that these are always great characters to build since they don't cost much to build and are pretty hard to replace. Some characters like Welt specifically can be both, cater to one side more than the other depending on how you use them and how many resources you're actually willing to invest. Tip number 3. Build around the characters you want to use for sure. In some cases, there'll be characters that you'll want to use basically no matter the situation. For cases like this, you might want to consider specific synergies that can exist between characters when making your team. For example, if you want to use Dan Heng as your main DPS, you may want to use Welt to consistently apply slow and therefore increasing your team's overall damage. If you're using Hook as your main DPS, you'll definitely benefit from using her with Himiko or Asta so that you can easily apply burn. You may want to pair Sampo with Serval to increase her shock damage. Japard works fantastic with Yanqing since he attracts aggro, freezes enemies, and has a massive shield to protect Yanqing so that he can keep his talent up. Pairing Asta with slows or imprisonment like Welt can increase your team's number of turns by quite a lot due to the speed buffs. You might want to use Pela with Jingyuan, for example, for the AoE defense shred. Tingyun with Yanqing works really well because of how the added damage stacks with his attacks and his follow-up attack. You might want to use a defense shred character over a single target buffer for a team that uses 2 DPSs since you can't buff both of them. This isn't an exhaustive list, and part of the fun is finding new synergies and ways that you pair your characters together. There's absolutely no way I could fit them all in this video anyways, so that's up to you to find out. As a side note, you might also want to consider the fact that some characters actually work against each other, and this mostly applies to people using Clara. Using Clara with Japard might not be great since they both attract aggro, and therefore can reduce your overall damage output, or maybe pairing slows, CC, or Welt with dot characters will reduce your overall DPS since the enemies will get their turns less often. Tip number 4. Build around the enemies. It's not likely you'll stick with exactly one team composition for most of the game due to elemental weaknesses. For cases like this, you'll want to use the perform engine rules to adjust your team so that it can function well, but still be catered to the content that you are doing. Anyways, with that in mind, remember that enemies have natural resistance to elements that they're not weak to, as well as if their toughness is up. Like I said before, you want at least one DPS character of some sort with the right element. For example, probably wouldn't bring only Natasha to fight Japard. Another thing to consider is that you might want to bring characters that specifically counter the enemy. And this is very true for the current Memory of Chaos. Buff, Strip, and Cleanse are very valuable, and this also applies to other boss mechanics. For characters like the Decaying Shadow, or enemies with very powerful charge-up attacks, you might want to bring characters or more characters that are very good at breaking that specific enemy, so that you can cancel their strong attacks. General team building. So finally, we're at the team building section. I'm going to be going over some common team archetypes, why they're good, and my thought process behind why I chose what characters. In my last video, I emphasized building up 2 teams or 8 characters specifically, and although that's still true, as you progress in the game, you'll want to build more characters and need to mix and match your characters to effectively keep up the Memory of Chaos. Hopefully, by looking at these examples and my thought process, you can get an idea of how to make teams for yourself. First off, we have the simplest team comp, the Hyper Carry team comp. In this team, we have one main DPS, someone who's extremely invested into, preferably someone with both good wave clear and single target damage. For most people, this will probably be characters like Seeley and Jikyuan, and hopefully you have a very juicy crit ratio as well as a high amount of attack because they're going to be the only ones doing damage. And to pair with main DPS, we'll have 2 utility characters. This will probably be something like a defense shred nihility character and a harmony character, or 2 harmony characters. For the last slot, you'll fill it with a survivability unit. For example, imagine we have Seeley, Silverwolf, Tingyun, and Bailu. Seeley tends to use extra skill points due to her multiple turns, but to counteract that, the rest of the characters that we're using are skill point positive. You can easily substitute some of these characters and get a really nice team as well. The double elemental typing of Quantum and Electric makes it a 50-50 chance for your Silverwolf E to apply the right element. Luckily, this team comp is pretty simple, so you can actually change out a lot of the characters and still get something that works in the same way. For example, you can take out Seele and put in Jing Yuan, and take out Silver Wolf and sub in someone like Welt, since they use more skill points, and Jing Yuan uses way less skill points than Seele does. There is one thing I need to caution you with, which is to be very careful about who you pick as your hyper carry. Since they have to be good at both killing a wave of enemies and in a single target scenario, you have to use someone that is really strong or has multiple turns. Personally, I've tried using Yan Qing as a hyper carry character, and despite doing a lot of damage, it doesn't feel that great to play since he doesn't get many turns and doesn't have any way of killing multiple enemies. This won't always be a problem, obviously depending on what you're doing, but it is something to consider. And also, as a final note, when it comes to gameplay, you'll definitely want to keep your hyper carry alive as much as possible, since your team is literally nothing without them. DPS split. This team is flexible in the sense that you can use skill points on whatever you need more. In this team, you'll probably be using 2 DPS characters, a utility character, and a survivability unit. With these 2 characters, you're probably going to have a variety of damage, both AoE and single target, and possibly 2 different elements as well. But for this specific example, we'll be going with a mono fire team. We'll have Hook as one of your DPSs, and Himiko as the other, Asta as your buffer, and Natasha for healing. Hook, Himiko, and Asta all use a lot of skill points, depending on how you use them, but that can be circumvented by a couple of things. Depending on who you like more, you've built better, but what the situation calls for, you can have Hook or Himiko as your main DPS, and the other will be your sub-DPS, meaning that you use skill points whenever you can spare them. Natasha will be running the Healer Relic set, most likely, unless you're kinda weird, giving you an extra skill point in the beginning, and this will let you start the turn with Himiko, Hook, and Asta using the skills. And again, you won't be using Natasha's since you just started the fight. After that, you only have to use skill on Asta if you get a good opportunity for it, or if you need to reapply her buff. And you'll be using your skill points on Himiko when there's a large number of enemies, and Hook mostly for the single target situations. And this team works especially well because of the synergy that Asta and Himiko have with Hook, both having inherent burns built into their kit, as well as Asta having multiple ways to increase your team's fire damage, and therefore increasing 3 of your characters' overall damage. Obviously though, this team is one element, that's something to consider, but other DPS splits will likely have multiple elements, which may or may not be a concern. Double survivability. This team has 2 survivability units. What a shocker. Basically, this is the go-to archetype if you're underleveled or undergeared, because it makes the game a lot easier. I would definitely recommend this for those who are struggling with weekly bosses, Simulated Universe, or Forgotten Hall. And here is the main team. Basically, you could use any combination of 2 survivability units, preferably 2 preservation or 1 preservation, 1 abundance. And if you put 2 abundance characters, you're a little freaky. 2 abundance characters is not really recommended because you lose out on a lot of damage and utility that you get from a preservation unit. Putting 2 survivability units reduces the need for you to use skill points on either of them, leaving you with more for your other characters. And since you already have 2 skill point positive characters, you can fill the rest with your skill point negative characters. I would probably go with something like 2 DPS characters, or 1 very strong DPS and 1 utility character. For this specific example, we'll take Serval and Sampo as your DPS characters, Fireblazer and Natasha for survivability. Serval and Sampo have very nice synergy, Sampo increasing the dot damage for both of them, and Serval having very consistent damage. The extra dot damage from Serval and Sampo kind of make up for the fact that you're only using 2 damage characters. Fireblazer will reduce the damage that your team takes in general and put out a decent amount of damage as well. Because of that, you won't need to taunt or heal as often, and that allows you to always spam skill on Serval and Sampo. Alternatively, you could change this general team. If the content isn't too hard, you could turn this team into a double DPS split by swapping out one of your survivability units for a utility character. This way you can build skill points while increasing your damage output. Anyways, to wrap things up, let's summarize what we learned today. We started by talking about the fundamentals to combat, element weaknesses, and skill point management. Using the right elements and breaking enemy toughness drastically increases your damage. We went over which characters were skill point positive and which ones were skill point negative. Then, we went over 4 tips. The first being skill point management. It's important to keep in mind who uses skill points and who generates skill points when building your team. Eventually, you want to reach some sort of equilibrium. With the second tip, we discussed the importance of balancing roles. We covered the nuances of different survivability classes, damage classes, and utility classes. With the third tip, we talked about character synergies and building around specific characters that you want to use. The last tip was to build around your enemies, and this was basically to take advantage of elemental weaknesses and gameplay weaknesses. We covered a couple of common team archetypes and why they work. Hopefully by the end of this video, you know how to build your teams better and overall improve your gameplay. If this video helped you, be sure to drop a like because it helps the channel out quite a lot. In any case, I'll catch you guys in the next one.